Good evening, everyone. I am Stephanie Pacifico, the marketing manager at PBS Western Reserve, the local public media organization that serves Northeast Ohio and Western Pennsylvania. We are delighted that you all could join us this evening for an exclusive preview of Ken Burns' newest documentary, The American Revolution, which will be followed by a panel discussion led by experts on the topic. Before we kick things off, we would like to take a moment to thank our friends at the Mahoning Valley Historical Society for partnering with us to host such an incredible event. We hope you all enjoyed your time viewing the captivating exhibits they have on display downstairs. Additionally, we would like to extend our thanks to the 3 panelists and moderator. Without their invaluable knowledge and expertise, this event would not have been possible. At PBS Western Reserve, we believe in the power of community. Through our outreach initiatives, quality programming, and educational resources, we strive to educate, illuminate, inspire, and empower individuals of all backgrounds to thrive and succeed. We take pride in our dedication to showcasing the unique stories, voices, and cultures of our communities across Northeast Ohio and Western Pennsylvania. Our local programming provides a platform for sharing narratives that might otherwise go untold. After the Ken Burns piece, we are going to present a locally produced video that features the Trumbull County Historical Society as they shed light on the American Revolutionary War veterans who are buried in Warren, Ohio, how many there are, and where you can find their resting places. Now I am pleased to present to you an abbreviated version of Ken Burns' newest documentary, The American Revolution. The full 12-hour documentary will begin on Sunday, November 16th from 8 to 10 o'clock p.m. through Friday, November 21st on PBS Western Reserve, and it will also be available to stream on the PBS app. Thank you all for believing in the power of public media. Enjoy the show.
Well, I think if we had the option, many of us would stick around for all 12 hours if we could. I'm very excited to see this. But we are going to turn this over. We're going to do a nice panel discussion now. We've got some great folks here that are going to take all of what we just saw and kind of bring it local. So I'm going to introduce our moderator for the evening, Dante Bernard. He is our museum educator here at the Mahoning Valley Historical Society. Over the last 2 years, the bulk of his work has been teaching over 13,000 students, some local history programs among many, many other things. He has a BA in history from YSU's Honors College. And in addition to his work here, he's a member of Youth 250, which is a cohort of Gen Z young leaders. There's 100 of them across the country who are bringing those young voices into the historical conversation with museums and historic sites as we are preparing and planning for exhibits and programs and events in conjunction with America 250. So Dante is going to take us into the next part of our evening. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. So, I think I'm going to do it this way. So, I think I'm first going to introduce all 3 of our panelists, and then once they come up here, they have all prepared something that they're going to be speaking about. After they have all finished speaking about what they have planned, we are then going to open it up to the floor for some questions and maybe have some of those burning questions answered for all of you. So, the first of our panelists that I'll be introducing tonight is Kate Pfouts, who was one of the ladies which you saw in the video that we had just watched. She is the archivist at the Trumbull County Historical Society. She earned a BA in anthropology from Youngstown State University and holds certificates in collections care and management from Beloit College. She is currently pursuing a master's degree in archival studies at Clayton State University, a lifelong living history interpreter with the Brigade of the American Revolution. Her undergraduate research explored Native American involvement in the Revolutionary War. Our next panelist is Dr. Amy Fluker. Dr. Amy Fluker is an associate professor of humanities and social sciences at Youngstown State University. She has a BA in history from Westminster College and an MA and PhD in history from the University of Mississippi. Her research interests include 19th century U.S. history, the American Civil War, and Civil War memory. She is a frequent speaker, active in local public history community, and recently published Haunted by Memory: Ghost Stories of the American Civil War. And finally, I'd like to introduce a man who needs no introduction, but I'll give him one anyway. Bill Lawson is the executive director of the Mahoning Valley Historical Society since 1991, and he has worked for the Historical Society since 1987. That's 38 years with MVHS and 34 as our executive director. Bill is a past president, trustee at large, and regional representative of the Ohio Local History Alliance. He is a member and past president of the Rotary Club of Youngstown and a board member for Youngstown Cityscape. He has been a guest lecturer for the History, American Studies, and Sociology departments at Youngstown State University, has authored articles and book reviews on history for local and professional periodicals, and is a co-author of the book Mahoning Memories, A History of Youngstown and Mahoning County. Lawson holds a BA and MA degrees in history from YSU. All right. Thank you three very much for being here with us tonight. I think this microphone right on the table, I think that's the one we're going to be using for the three of us. Is it on? Now it is.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. If you would like, Kate, would you like to start?
Yeah.
All right, perfect.
Okay, so I want to talk about Fort Lawrence, which is Ohio's only Revolutionary War fort. So we see Fort Lawrence come into the picture in 1778. At this point, we have a lot happening on the eastern seaboard in the United States, or what will be the United States. And so the British at this time are occupying Fort Detroit, and the Americans are occupying Fort Pitt. And the British are wanting to take American attention away from the eastern seaboard. So they start having their Native American allies start kind of causing trouble in the Ohio country, trying to pull American attention away from that eastern seaboard, and it works. And so the Americans then start trying to plan how they can plan an attack against Fort Detroit. But Fort Pitt is way too far away to try and launch an attack that would actually be successful. So they realize that they need to create some sort of stepping stone to get there, which is why Fort Lawrence comes into play. And so the Continental Congress orders the men to go out there to the Tuscarawas Valley, which is about an hour and a half south from us, and start building this fort for three main purposes. And so the first is they are wanting to have that stepping point to get to Fort Detroit. They want to protect the American settlers that are now in the Ohio country, even though at this time they were not supposed to be. And then the third is to protect the Delaware Indians, who were their major ally during the war. The Delaware were some of the only Native Americans that were siding with the Americans. The rest were all siding with the British, and we do have an exception with the Delaware that one of their clans was siding with the British. Which kind of comes into play later when Fort Lawrence is under attack, and both the clans have to kind of come to a settlement. But so the Continental Congress goes out, builds this fort. They were very unprepared. They had almost no supplies. They were told not to go on this adventure out to the Tuscarawas Valley, and they did so anyways. So after the first 1,200 men that built the fort were there, they returned back to Fort Pitt. We are now in November, December of 1778, and they are starving to death at this point. The Delaware Indians were the ones who led them to the fort. They're the ones that are bringing in food. They are carrying messages back from Fort Lawrence to Fort Pitt, which is the only way communication is getting between the two. And so the Americans are really relying on the Delaware to survive this winter. And then the siege of Fort Lawrence happens around March of 1779. And that's when we have the Delawares going out and trying to create this peace between the Native Americans that were allied with the British, which were some of the Delawares, as well as just trying to create a general peace to stop the siege. The siege was then ended about a month later, and Fort Lawrence was ultimately abandoned in August of 1779. An attack on Fort Detroit was basically impossible with Fort Lawrence. With no food, the men were resorting to roasting and boiling their moccasins to try and have some sort of nutrition. And so Fort Lawrence ultimately failed. It had been called by a lot of the soldiers that were there called Fort Nonsense. So it really had a unique place in the war, but not like we would have thought.
All right, thank you very much. I think we can hand it over to Dr. Amy Fluker now.
Okay, well, I want to take us a little post-war. As I was trying to think about what I could share this evening that would connect to local history, I thought about, well, what do I teach about the American Revolution in my History of Ohio class at YSU? And the thing that I enjoy teaching most about the Revolutionary era in that course is actually talking about the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So a kind of dry and dusty document, I guess, but I think it's really important for understanding the legacy of the American Revolution. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. As a way of thinking about how the ideals of the American Revolution become reality, ideals that we heard about in the film this evening, freedom and self-government. But what's really revolutionary about the War for Independence is that it results in this idea of framing a government around those ideals. That's the radicalism of the American Revolution. And I have to kind of claim some personal privilege and briefly quote the Hamilton musical, which I understand has been a topic of conversation around here this evening. But in the musical, George Washington says, "Winning is easy, governing is harder." And I do think that's very true. In some ways, it's a lot easier to voice ideals, even to fight and die for them, than it is to translate them into some kind of workable, unified, sustainable frame of government. And as I'm sure we will learn if we watch the 12-hour saga of the American Revolution, we'll know that American unity was always a challenge. And that's definitely a challenge in the post-war era too. So I think of that as the greatest legacy of the American Revolution, forming this government. The American Revolution makes a case of the significance of these important ideals for all mankind, as Thomas Paine says, of what we believe, that all men are created equal, that they're entitled to natural rights, and that just governments protect those rights. But how do you take that, again, and translate that into a workable frame of government? During the war, Massachusetts sort of starts that ball rolling. They draft a new state constitution, as does the state of Pennsylvania. And those constitutions both contain affirmations of these rights that were so profoundly and beautifully expressed in the Declaration of Independence. And they also contain, for lack of a better term, lists of rights that Americans possess. So these documents are the first places we're going to see Americans codify things like freedom of worship, freedom of speech, your right to petition, due process. But those are state level, right, governments. So the first sort of, as I see it, enactment of the ideals of the revolution on the federal level really comes through this Northwest Ordinance. So if you don't remember from your, I don't know, 4th grade History of Ohio class, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is designed to help transform the Ohio country, the Northwest Territory, into the first, essentially, of the new United States. So on one hand, it's a very practical document that contains a step-by-step process by which a territory can become a state. But more importantly, it contains a Protean Bill of Rights. So this is 1787. This is before the Bill of Rights is added into the US Constitution. And so in this document, and I brought it with me like a good historian, I brought my sources. This document contains, as I said, essentially the Protean version of the Bill of Rights. It promises to extend, quote, the fundamental principles of civil and religious liberty. It goes on to say that no person shall ever be molested on account of his mode of worship or religious sentiments in the Northwest Territory. It says the inhabitants of the territory shall always be entitled to the benefits of the writ of habeas corpus and trial by jury. There shall be no cruel and unusual punishments. It also says religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. Schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. And this really struck me in the clip as we were learning about the importance of the idea of virtue to the founders. This is exactly right, trying to ensure the success of building a virtuous citizenry, protecting, especially establishing, I should say, the idea of public schooling here in the Northwest Territory. It goes on to say that the utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. Their land shall never be taken from them without their consent. And then critically, it also says, there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the territory. So again, this is post-revolution, but I think of it as so critical to establishing the legacy of the American Revolution, turning it into something meaningful and practical in terms of a frame of government. This is establishing the process by which new states can join the Union. This is establishing the process by which the United States is going to grow and expand. And this is the point at which the United States is saying, in the clip, it talked about the idea that we can begin the world anew. Well, they begin the world anew here in the Ohio country with this Northwest Ordinance. This is the first opportunity they had to establish governments that were totally free of the legacies of British colonialism. We're outside of those 13 original colonies, right? Outside of those original colonies, which they acknowledged in the Declaration of Independence, rested on seized Indian land and had been tainted by the institution of slavery. This was their opportunity to build the world anew, and they do that here in the Ohio country, and they do that with the Northwest Ordinance. And I think that's really important, and I think the Northwest Ordinance ought to be canonized with our founding documents. So I'm a big proponent of that. And of course, I guess I'll wrap up by saying we know that the kind of unity that the founders hoped to establish in their new frame of government was very fragile. You heard I'm a Civil War historian, so I'm always looking down the road, 100 so years, knowing that the issues that were at the heart of this conflict are, in many ways left unresolved, and Americans are going to continue to struggle and work towards living up to those ideals and ensuring that they're perfecting this frame of government to extend those liberties to the greatest number of people. But yeah, that was what I wanted to share with you this evening, a reflection on the Northwest Ordinance.
Wonderful, thank you so much. All right, and finally, Bill Lawson.
Thanks, Dante. I want to take a little different tack because I think we're all very much into Ken Burns and the way he puts together a documentary. And what makes them so profound and special is the everyday stories of everyday people that he weaves into the broader, more significant narratives. And this 12-hour presentation that's coming up in November will be no exception. And of course, he's probably going to be working with dozens, maybe 100 or so stories, but there are literally hundreds of thousands, if not more than 1 million stories out there in terms of how people lived and worked and survived and suffered during the American Revolution, which in terms of actual armed conflict, something we really need to consider is that it lasted 8 years. And 8 years of sporadic fighting, as was in the preview, the masts appearing in harbors up and down the East Coast. And that's twice as long as the American Civil War. That's twice as long as World War II. So it's a very trying period. And what I want to do is tell the story of one person who I've come to know only probably within the last 11 years, and just lay that out to you for the next couple of minutes. His name is William Lowry, and he was born probably in 1760, but possibly the latter part of 1759 in Chester County, which is near Philadelphia in eastern Pennsylvania. He is probably the first or second generation in his family who were Ulster Scots, who immigrated from the Ulster plantations and provinces of Ireland to the Pennsylvania colony in the earlier 18th century. He grew up in Chester County, and during the Revolution enlisted as a private in the Pennsylvania militia in June of 1777, and that enlistment was for 2 months under the orders of Captain Ramsey's company in Chester County, which was under Major Hartley of the Pennsylvania militia. He enlisted again as a private for 2 months in 1778, once again in Captain Ramsey's company. And then after that, sometime probably by 1780, as a young man of maybe 20, he traveled across the Allegheny Mountains into what is now western Pennsylvania and settled there in a place now called New Galilee, which is in now Beaver County, Pennsylvania. And then in May of 1782, he again enlisted as a private, this time in Captain Thomas Rannikin's company, which was under the command of Colonels David Williamson and William Crawford. Now, this was a significant part of the history in the western front of the Revolution, especially almost a year after Yorktown, the capitulation by the British in Yorktown. But what was happening at that time was that there were many incursions by Indians with help from the British into the western part of Pennsylvania, and also back into the Ohio country by Pennsylvanians' militia. And one of the most awful and shameful of those occurred in March of 1782, when 96 Moravian pacifist Indians were butchered and killed at Gnadenhutten in the massacre of March of 1782, and this was put on by Pennsylvania militiamen. In the aftermath of that, there was an increase of raids into Pennsylvania, into the communities in western Pennsylvania, and this led to the call for militia again in May of 1782 to do something to stop it. And they gathered in May, and once again, William Lowry joined on for a 2-month enlistment with Colonel Williamson and Crawford, and set out for what is the upper Sandusky area in northwest Ohio. And this area was prairie, and so it was a lot different from the woodlands that covered the rest of Ohio and then, of course, Pennsylvania. And the volunteer militia of at least 500 strong were following on a plan to hit the Indian villages and encampments along the upper Sandusky River Valley and push them and eventually the British out all the way to Fort Detroit, if not further. And that was the plan. It was not very well conceived, and by the first week of June, they were coming closer to their target, but they were also running low on provisions, and some of the militia were deserting, and they thought they were coming in as a surprise, but as it turns out, scouts had seen them coming and notified the British and the Indian warriors that they were on the way, and so by the time they hit the encampments and villages. Some were empty, and then they ended up in the prairie, and that's when they encountered the native warriors and the British. And there was 2 days of skirmishes on June 4th and 5th, of which the militia ran low on their ammunition and also their supplies. They gained nothing out of it other than casualties. There were some on the other side as well, but the evening of June 5th, they decided to retreat at night, hopefully to get out and start going back to Pennsylvania. It was a disorganized affair, and the Indians and British knew that it was happening and began to pursue, which created some mayhem, and it became a very ragged retreat and also a rout as they had to fight running away against the Indians and the British. And the whole of this affair, which was a loss, a very tragic one, 70 militia members were killed, which is more than 10% of the total. And those included several who were captured in the ragged retreats, and Colonel Crawford. He was subjected to hours of torture and burned at the stake in retaliation for the Gnadenhutten massacre. And the rest who survived made their way back to their communities in Pennsylvania, and that included Private Lowry, who was among some of the survivors. In the aftermath of the war, in 1783, he married Sarah Wilson, also a Chester County, Pennsylvania native. They had 6 children, 4 girls and 2 boys. Private Lowry, William Lowry, owned and operated a farm in Big Beaver Township near the village of New Galilee throughout the rest of his life. We know that he applied for a federal pension as a soldier of the Revolutionary War in 1831 when he was in his early 70s, and received $20 per annum once that was approved for the remainder of his life. And he died in May 1842 at the age of 82 and is buried in Mount Pleasant Cemetery in Big Beaver Township. So that's one brief story of a combatant and a person who lived through the Revolution. I'm fortunate to be able to tell that because William Lowry is and was my 4th great-grandfather. And that's why I'm here telling it, that he survived it as a 6th-generation descendant of him and Sarah Wilson Lowry. And that's where I want to leave it, and we can go to questions, I guess.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, well, I know that I took a couple notes down for questions to potentially ask, but I don't want to take any of that time away from any of you lovely people. So if you have any of the questions that have popped up from the beginning of when you got here to after you just heard these 3 panelists speak, yeah, I'd be happy to start taking some questions. Why don't I start right up here. I will take the microphone off of you. Thank you so much. All right.
That's a real commitment with the microphone. Amy Fluker, hello. I'm so glad that you're here. Do we know who wrote this thing and what prompted its penning? Is that a word, penning? Anyway.
What an excellent question that I had written down in my notes and forgot to say, so thank you. So officially the Articles Confederation Congress writes the Northwest Ordinance, but very heavy hand of Thomas Jefferson is present here, who had written a previous ordinance, 1784, and they, so a lot of the language there specifically in terms of the rights that the inhabitants of this new territory would possess, I think we owe that to Jefferson.
All right. Any other questions? Yes, we'll go right in the back. Thank you so much. Get my steps in.
Okay, Amy, you're going to laugh at this question, but I think it either might be best answered by Bill, but either one of you. Also, Trumbull County's equation as well. So in the film, they talked about certain goods that were taxed, British goods. One of those, of course, was artists' pigments or paints. And for one reason or the other, I went down a rabbit hole. And I'm wondering, at what point did those taxes, I guess, become lessened? And if we have found, A, what the pigments might have been, or B, if we know in terms of, I guess, architecture, because I'm assuming a lot of this was based on construction or other goods, what we know about what we have access to. I don't know if that is a vague enough or a specific enough question.
I have a partial answer for you, Jonathan. I don't remember if the tax on pigments was a part of the Townsend duties. So those there's pushback to them. Obviously, I guess watch episode 1 for more on colonial protests to those duties. The taxes are revised and reinforced. So they would have been in flux in the 10 years before the revolution breaks out. In terms of what kind of pigments, the best thing I can to say in answer to that question, that's tough. So the Carolinas were producing indigo. So that would be my best, sort of guess offer as a pigment that colonists would be upset about it being taxed because that's being produced in the Americas. And their big grievance is that why should we have to pay British duties on things that we're producing ourselves? So that's my best guess answer for you.
All right, I think I saw another hand go up. Yes, right there in the back. Thank you.
Why were the Delaware Indians the only ones to support the Americans?
I wrote that same question down.
This is a really great question. So most of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy that we know were siding with the British because the British were promising land afterwards. They were promising, if we win the war, we're gonna give you back all your lands. We don't want them, we'll give them to you. And so this was a great promise for the natives that were seeing the Americans come in, taking their land. And so most of them were then siding with the British because of this. But the Delaware had Moravian missionaries living amongst them for 30-some years before the American Revolution broke out. And so you have people like David Zeisberger, who was very prominent at this time, who had been living with them. And the Moravians were more inclined to side with the Americans. And so they had this inherent bias that was then getting kind of passed off onto the Delaware that they were living with. And the Delaware were trying to stay as neutral as possible in the war, but because of this Moravian influence, they were leaning more towards helping the Americans, so that's why they were so influential in getting the Americans food, being message carriers, helping them throughout the Ohio country on the trails. They just had that overall influence that other Native American tribes did not have.
How did this split with the Delaware Indians? How did that affect?
It gets very complicated. So we have the Turtle Clan that ended up splitting off and going with the British. And again, it's kind of that land claim that the British were giving. And then the Turkey, and I don't remember the other name, clans were the ones that were living with the Moravian missionaries. So it just kind of ended up being this split, and the kind of overall leader of the Turtle Clan was kind of really against the Americans for past things that had happened, so they were more inclined to go with the British.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Yes. There you go.
Thank you. The short piece about Trumbull County and the
veterans who are buried there. Alluded at the end that there's an equal number in Mahoning County. And if any of you can answer, is there one particular cemetery here in Mahoning County that has a number of Revolutionary War veterans? And just a question of curiosity, what's the one that lived the longest? Did any of them, I know there were certain veterans that made it to the Civil War. They had photographed them in their hundreds years of age, but if it's known, which was the longest lived?
I'm going to hand off to Pam Space, who's our archivist, who has just done a survey of Revolutionary War veterans, and you can give me some stats.
Well, I'm actually still in the middle of doing the research, but there is a over 2,500 page PDF that the state has available that I've downloaded, and I'm slowly trying to go through for Mahoning and Trumbull counties. Their stats are showing approximately 241 for Trumbull County and 315 for Mahoning. I say approximate because different surname variations may indicate that a patriot may be listed in there more than once. But I'm slowly trying to pull them out so that when someone asks that question, we can answer them. I don't have a definite answer for you, Brian, right now, but I've noticed a number of them actually survive into the 1840s, a couple from into the 1850s. I expected quite a few for both counties, but honestly, I didn't expect the numbers that I'm seeing. Although it does make sense if you stop and you think about it. They're the ones who were promised land in payment for their service in some cases. Other times they were the most mobile. Their children were becoming adults and they came out here when the lands opened up with their children in many cases. And this is where they passed away. I'm seeing a lot of burials, definitely in the Pioneer Cemetery in Warren. Oak Hill's got its amount. They're all over the county. I really haven't done it. I'm still in the B's, to be honest with you. I don't have a definite feel, but I am getting a feeling that they were all over both counties, and they can be found in the township cemeteries, in the family cemeteries, on the farms. A lot of them, one notation that keeps coming up over and over again, and this list was apparently generated by the Sons of the American Revolution and the Daughters of the American Revolution. So they also notated many times that either the stones were gone or they were no longer readable, and that they would find the patriot's wife buried next to this stone that couldn't be read. So their best guess was that this individual was perhaps buried with his wife. So I've got it downstairs. If anybody wants to look at the PDF itself, call me during normal business hours and I'll tell you where to find it. But I am still working through it, so I don't have a definite answer for you.
That's a great answer. And as Pam mentioned, each of the townships throughout the old Western Reserve and in our portion of it, when they organized, which was primarily late 1790s to early 1820s, part of that was providing a burial ground for township residents. And so they're there. In the case of Youngstown, which, believe it or not, was a township at one point, the old township cemetery was located on what is now Wick Avenue between Commerce Street and Wood Street, on either side of Wick Avenue, where you now have a parking lot and the Nathaniel Jones Federal Courthouse. And obviously it's not there anymore. That's because it was moved to Oak Hill Cemetery in the mid-19th century as pressure on development in what's now downtown Youngstown increased, especially after the Civil War.
Thank you very much. And can we get another round of applause for Pam Space, our archivist? I'm very glad we can get her in front of you. She is such a font of information. Any other questions? Any other questions? Yes.
They quoted in the documentary Benjamin Franklin from 1854 talking about the legacy, so to speak, of the Native Americans that had their own type of constitution or whatever that appeared to be successful. So, and that was largely ignored at the time, but what major influences other than that, or was that the major influence on the development of our Constitution? Is that discussed in the documentary in depth, or can you add any information to that?
So I've only seen as much of the documentary as you saw, so I'm not sure if it'll be elaborated on. But yes, so the importance of the Constitution of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy has generally been credited as an inspiration for the US Constitution. But I did some research on this question recently back over the summer, and it's a little unclear. So Benjamin Franklin was certainly aware of it and talked about it, but we don't have any direct evidence, say, from Independence Hall that delegates to the Continental Congress directly reference it, right? So we believe that they knew about it through sort of osmosis, and we do definitely know that Benjamin Franklin talked about it. So in terms of it being an influence on the US Constitution, that's something that historians began talking about around the bicentennial, sort of brought that back to popular knowledge. And like I said, the most direct evidence that we have is that Benjamin Franklin wrote about it and knew about it. Oh shoot, there was something else I was gonna add to that. Other influences, certainly they look at Magna Carta, as a sort of a homegrown influence on their principles and on, the necessity of limiting power of an executive. They are also, of course, very inspired by antiquity, and that's part of the reasons we heard in the documentary that they put such an emphasis on the idea of virtue. That was an ancient, sort of Greek and Roman attribute that they are drawing upon. Yeah, I guess that's the sort of maybe the best I can answer.
Awesome. All right. What other questions do we have? Yes. And I apologize if I'm not turning my head right enough. If you're raising your hand and I'm not seeing you, please just scream out at me.
The Connecticut Land Company that sold all this property, how did they originally acquire all that land?
So this land was originally given to the colony of Connecticut by, I'm gonna forget, King Charles, perhaps, in the 1600s. So this land was designated to them. We get through the American Revolution, and Connecticut is, of course, in debt, and they're trying to kind of reclaim some of their losses from the war. And so they start selling off parts of the land that they were originally chartered back in 1600 to kind of recover from that financially. And so they start selling it off to wealthy people such as Pierpont Edwards. And so it also tends to go into almost like a lottery of, will you win this land if you kind of put some money into the pot for it? So we see that happening. But also part of the Western Reserve was saved off for people of Connecticut who had lost their homes during the war. So a lot of homes were burnt down, a lot of towns were lost, and so that land was also designated for people to move out. So a lot of the settlers that we see are coming from Connecticut. I hope that answers that a little bit.
I just want to add that the Connecticut land claim, which had gone on for more than a century, was very much part of the political process of creating the Ohio Territory and then the state of Ohio, because the state of Connecticut and the colony of Connecticut held on to that land claim right up until they fashioned an agreement with the federal government of the United States to allow jurisdiction, United States federal government, while Ohio was a territory, and then the state of Ohio, over basically northeastern Ohio, because it was still claimed by Connecticut, even though they were beginning to sell it off. So it's, I'm just scratching the surface of that story right now, but it is interesting how long it went on for and what it took to separate the state of Connecticut from northeastern Ohio.
All right, thank you very much. I also just kind of want to point out one thing I have written down here, and I just want to plug into there, is Kate had said that a lot of the homes and a lot of land was burned in Connecticut and was kind of passed off to some of the residents of Connecticut to kind of move on out here. And so when the name or the title Firelands are given to parts of the Western Reserve, there's definitely a connection there. Any other questions?
I want to piggyback on you, Dante, just because I never miss an opportunity to dunk on Benedict Arnold. So the Firelands in particular were for people who had their homes destroyed by Arnold after he turned coat and went back to his home state, his home colony, and burned the homes of his friends and neighbors. So yeah, a connection to Benedict Arnold then also here locally.
Thank you so much. Yes.
I can talk loud.
Okay.
I'm a teacher. I just wanted to say, since I don't know where everybody here is from, if you're looking at the Connecticut Western Reserve Road is actually the border of that. If you're south of Western Reserve Road, you're not in the reserve. North of it, you are. So for those who aren't from directly around here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think I saw another hand go up. Yeah, I'll get right next to you first.
Yeah, I don't need the mic.
Okay.
I think maybe a point of clarity when we're looking at the revolutionary fighters from Trumbull County Mahoning County and Trumbull County. There was no counties for that in the Revolution. I mean, Mahoning wasn't a county until 1846 or 48, somewhere in there. So it's, I think it's kind of fair to say that Mahoning County is also taken from parts of Columbiana County. So it's kind of, it's more of a conglomerate, of those three counties, that there wasn't those counties. But, I mean, we got to find the ancestors somewhere. So, but right now we have counties. But back then there was no county. It was just this general area.
Absolutely, definitely. Thank you for the point of clarity. Yes, over here.
We just returned from a 10-day boat trip up the St. Lawrence Seaway, and we stopped at many small towns along that in Canada. And one of the towns that we were in, I don't remember the name of the town, but they said that it was kind of founded by the former mayor of Albany, New York. And I said, what was the mayor of Albany, New York doing in Canada? And I learned about the Loyalists. And I have labored my entire life under the misconception that everybody that was in America wanted to break off from England, but there was a whole group that didn't want to do it. Maybe one of you could expound upon that just a little bit.
Wonderful, thank you so much.
Well, maybe because I'm, again, a Civil War historian by training, this question has always interested me. In many ways, the American Civil War is a civil war. Of course, it's a rebellion against the mother country, but then the American population is very deeply divided, as you learned. So the stat that my textbook gives, that I teach, my students, historians estimate that about half of the population is actually pretty disengaged from the revolution. The remaining half, about 25% are patriots and 25% are loyalists. And the things that might, push you into the category of loyalist would be, as Kate pointed out, if you're a Native American, you're probably more likely to be a loyalist. If you are an enslaved person, it fluctuates, but you might be drawn to the British cause, especially because they offered emancipation to American slaves at a point in the conflict. You might be more likely to live in the southern colonies, where they had less of a stronger tradition of self-government than the northern colonies had. So yeah, those are just some of the sort of push and pull factors that might lead you to be in one camp or another.
Did the loyalists take up arms against?
Oh yeah.
So they joined the British, or did they independently take up arms against?
Well, they joined in fighting for the British cause. Also, there was, shall we say, very local, regional conflicts going on in counties and places, depending on who occupied that village or town or county, where they'd take turns destroying each other's property and running people out. Yeah, I think Ken Burns is going to really bring out that this isn't a civil war as well as a war for independence. And the only other thing I want to say is we need to look at not only major events such as the American Revolution and the Civil War and the War of 1812 and whatnot along the way, but everything that's happening in the revolutionary period is part of a continuum in terms of the development of North America as a predominantly British colony. And what's happening in the mid-1770s to the mid-1780s is directly related to what happened during the 7 Years' War, the 1755 to 1763, and then the Proclamation of 1763, which basically divided the eastern part of the British colonies for European settlers and the western part for Indian settlers. There were people that were dislocated or still part of that bigger process. And so a lot of what was not solved by the revolution went along through the 1780s to the Constitutional Convention, to the War of 1812, even to the great upheaval of the 1790s involving Great Britain and France and the early United States. What I'm saying is, when you start looking at these things, you have to make those connections over generations and periods. And you can tie the American Revolution to the American Civil War just because of the unfinished business in between.
I have a hand over. Thank you so much.
I just learned this, the Atlantic has a whole issue on the American Revolution, which I just finished reading, but I didn't know that Benjamin Franklin and his son were split. So this wasn't a matter even like this group, but in a family. And they were very, very close, but his son sided with the British. That's what he was. And it's interesting because the father never forgave him, although the son, it seems to me, was behaving very honorably afterwards.
Any comments on it? Okay, go right on over here.
Thank you again. Just real quickly, in bringing that up about loyalists, anybody who had Dr. Rhonda at YSU for the American Revolution will remember we all had to do papers on the loyalist claims. And as I recall, they were was very proud that they were archived in the Mog Library. And I remember on video or microfiche that you had to do a comparison between different colonies. And if you were smart enough, you picked like Rhode Island and Georgia because they had the least amount of population to be able to draw off of the different things. But yeah, that was part of anybody who had Dr. Rhonda's class on American Revolution. You had to dig into those loyalist claims. And I think it was Adams who said at any time, 1/3 were for independence, 1/3 were with the British, and the other third just went with whatever the way the wind was blowing in their neighborhood. So.
Thank you very much. All right, any other questions? Ooh, I'll go right all the way in the back.
So this is kind of like an alternate history scenario. What if the British had been successful in putting down the revolution? Would they have upheld those agreements that they were giving to their Native American allies and that they would be able to keep their land? Or do you think we would have seen what eventually the United States did with the westward expansion and the subjugation of Native Americans, much like we saw the British do after the Revolutionary War in places like Africa and India?
Thank you so much. I love that question.
Okay, so I definitely think we would have seen them go back on everything that they would have promised. So the lands would have been taken regardless. They were just trying to get the Native Americans on their side in whatever means that they could. And so they really were just fake, empty promises to the natives to get them on their side. And same with enslaved people at the time as well, promising them their freedom. It was the British that were bringing them here. They were, from the very beginning, the transatlantic slave trade was happening. And so nothing would have really changed in matters of Native Americans keeping their land. It would have been taken regardless.
All right, we have time for one more question. One more question. I think I'll go for this gentleman right here.
I noticed you mentioned Gnadenhutten and I seem to remember from 60 years ago when I was taking Ohio history at Howland, my teacher mentioning something about Aaron Burr being in that neck of the woods at one point and doing something bad.
So I think Burr's not at Gnadenhutten, but I think what you're remembering is that he does show up. Help me with the pronunciation. Yeah, Blennerhassett Island outside of Marietta. So he becomes involved in some kind of nefarious, after he murders Alexander Hamilton, he ends up in being involved in a plot with the Blennerhassetts to form basically an independent army that, at least when they are ultimately prosecuted for this, the word is that their goal was to try to seize essentially the Louisiana Purchase and establish a rival government under Burr's leadership. Burr is acquitted, and then because Burr is acquitted, Blennerhassett is acquitted. So ultimately the courts decide there's no substance to this plot, but I think that's what you're remembering, Burr and Blennerhassett and this maybe attempt to form a rival American republic.
I just want to make a quick little point. So in the PBS video that Trumbull County Historical Society did, we mentioned John Stark Edwards, whose home that we operate. So Aaron Burr is actually the cousin of John Stark Edwards. They have direct ties through John Stark Edwards' father's sister, who married Aaron Burr Sr. They then had Aaron Burr Jr., who we know then killed Hamilton in 1804. So just kind of interesting connections there.
Okay, here's one. It's perfect, just totally selfish personal connection for you. There, in my genealogy, there is an Aaron Burr Fluker. And I just think, wow, what Aaron Burr Fluker would probably think of me today, I don't know. But I do just have to brag also. So I am the 5th great-granddaughter of George Fluker, who served under Nathaniel Greene in the American Revolution out of the South Carolina militia. So all praise for George Fluker. I don't know about this Aaron Burr Fluker, though.
All right, well, thank you all very much. I would like to once again thank Kate, Dr. Amy Fluker, and Bill for joining us tonight on this panel. Can we get a round of applause for them? And I would like to thank PBS Western Reserve for sharing this with us. Thank you very much. This is something we were all greatly looking forward to, and I think we all had a pretty good time. It was really good, and I'm really interested to watch the rest of this come November. So one final note, it is, I believe, still raining outside, so please, please, please be so careful on your way home. But thank you all so much for spending an evening with us, and have a great rest of your night.